Welcome to the 38th National Pesticide Forum, Cultivating Healthy Communities. I'm Jay Feldman, Executive Director of Beyond Pesticides. I welcome you on behalf of the staff and board of Beyond Pesticides and the co-convener, the Institute for Exposamic Research at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, and all the co-sponsors of this event. We are so pleased to be able to launch this virtual forum on the 40th anniversary of Beyond Pesticides' founding in 1981. When I first became immersed in the pesticide problem and the solutions in the late 1970s, I met with farm workers in the fields and labor camps of Florida, Texas, and California. The problems were clear as they are today. Pesticide exposure, an inadequate worker protection standard, the absence of personal protective equipment, the lack of a living wage, and the insensitivity to the impact of poisons on human health, children, families, farm communities, and on the ecosystems that support life. We arranged for federal officials, appointees of the President of the United States, and state government officials to hear from farm workers about this human tragedy, and small family farmers told a similar story of illness. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency funded this work to collect the information directly from farm workers. But as agribusiness and the agrochemical industry and their representatives in Congress got wind of this work, the project was defunded. That was the impetus for launching Beyond Pesticides. We set up in Washington and organized a board of directors of farm worker, consumer, and environmental organizations, farmers, and a physician. We continued pressure. EPA did in 1992 finally adopt a worker protection standard, better, but still with limitations. We began hearing from people in urban, suburban, and rural areas about pesticide exposure from lawn care companies, in schools along rights of way, or from pesticide drift. The accounts flooded in on poisoning and illness, bird and bee deaths, fish kills and contaminated waterways, contaminated homes, and dangerous residues in food. Of course, Rachel Carson had warned society about this in her book, Silent Spring, in 1962, nearly 20 years earlier. We began assembling analyses of the failure of law to protect health, and the data piled up, connecting pesticides to major illnesses. We created databases to ensure that science informs our grassroots advocacy. The solution became clear: advance organic land management and ecological practices for insect management, as well as safe practices for buildings, from homes to schools to hospitals. Many of our values and principles are now embedded in the Organic Foods Production Act. A holistic standard, a precautionary approach, defined practices, allowed and prohibited substances, and a certification system with inspections. Now agribusiness and the agrochemical industry want a piece of the growing organic market, and we must now defend the law's organic principles. Absolutely critical to confronting the climate crisis, biodiversity collapse, and the most serious health threats. These principles are now being applied to local ordinances as local governments embrace efforts to eliminate fossil fuel-based pesticides and fertilizers. A bit about the conference format. We chose this virtual platform because it is interactive and enabling the sharing of information through posters and booths and direct contact with speakers and attendees. We're trying to replicate a real conference, a live conference. If you have not yet set up an informational site at the forum, send us a message at info@beyondpesticides.org and we'll get you the necessary information. With the cross-section of conference speakers and participants from diverse backgrounds, geography, disciplines, from the US and around the world, I'm already feeling the energy of the conference. We believe in the critical importance of coming together annually through the National Forum, sharing essential science, policy issues, and action strategies to advance urgently needed and meaningful change. Thank you for being a part of the forum and sharing your knowledge and experience over the next 4 days. And now the podium goes to Beyond Pesticides Board Chair, Dr. Routt Reigart.
Hello, I'm Routt Reigart. I'm chairman of the board of Beyond Pesticides. I'm also a professor emeritus of pediatrics at the Medical University of South Carolina. I'd like to welcome all of you to this conference. It's a new effort for us. We've had our pesticide forum annually for many, many years. And unfortunately, last year, the conference that was scheduled in Boulder, Colorado had to be canceled because of the COVID pandemic. We're very excited though, because this pandemic has given us the opportunity to do something very different and exciting, which is this conference that begins today and will continue for 3 more sessions in the coming weeks. Broadly speaking, today is an introduction to the activities and the interests of Beyond Pesticides. But also today and the next one will give you a lot of backstory or background to pesticides and their effect in ecologic systems. Our overall goal is to improve the ecology by removing pesticides from our systems. The last 2 days will be more focused on some of the specific ways that we have worked to remove pesticides from our system and develop more sustainable systems. In all of this, our eventual aim is to remove pesticides from our environment, recognizing that pesticides are meant to kill, and they never kill just what they are intended to kill, and therefore upsetting our ecology. And you may hear about things like the insect apocalypse, with the understanding that we may actually be, by our use of pesticides around the world, actually getting rid of all insects, including many useful insects. Likewise, there's very good evidence now that some of the pesticides that are being used are very toxic to pollinators, and you'll hear a little bit about that today. And, pollinators are critical to our food system. Today, we've got some very exciting talks, ending with Dr. Tom Lovejoy, who will be talking about the concept of biodiversity and the way in which pesticides adversely harm the biodiversity of our ecologic systems. I will be working today in something near and dear to my heart, a workshop that looks at the effects of pesticides on children. The reason that's important to me, other than I'm a pediatrician, is we recognize that children are something like 20% of our population, but they represent 100% of our future. So we're looking at the fact that children, as they grow and develop from prior to birth through early years of life, due to their rapidly development of biologic systems, neurology, and development, are very likely and susceptible to the adverse effects of pesticides. And this has been my major focus through my career, and I'm glad that we're going to have a workshop on it today. Thank you all for being here. We hope that you'll attend all the sessions, and we're looking forward to the next 4 weeks. Thank you very much.
I'm Dr. Robert Wright. I'm a pediatrician and medical toxicologist at Mount Sinai School of Medicine, and I'm really honored to be here. This is the second time that Mount Sinai has co-convened this forum with Beyond Pesticides, and we're really excited. This is actually my first time speaking at this forum, and I'm particularly excited to tell you about exposomics. So exposomics is a new approach to environmental health. And it's going to be important for understanding pesticides as well. So a simple way to explain it is it's very similar to genomics, except in genomics, you're trying to understand all the genetic variation and how that may impact health. In exposomics, we're trying to understand all the environmental variation and how that impacts health. And it's in many ways more complicated than genomics because your DNA sequence is the same the day you're born as the day you die, but your environment or your exposome changes all the time. But the way we do it is actually we measure everything we possibly can, and then we try to screen all those different chemicals that we're finding, whether it's in your blood or in your urine, or whether it's in your environment like your soil or your water or the air. And we try to find the ones that seem to be related to health. And then just as genomics tries to replicate those findings independently over and over again, we try to do that as well. And it's a very different way to look at environmental health. And we will discover those pesticides that are related to health if we do this approach. And in many ways, it's a lot faster. So if you think about lead poisoning is probably the most famous environmental toxicant, and it's been very, very well studied. But the first signs that lead was toxic to children in the literature were probably over 100 years ago. And yet lead wasn't taken out of paint until 1978, and it wasn't taken out of gasoline until 1989. So it took 60 years to gather enough evidence, scientific evidence, to ban lead paint or to ban leaded gasoline, because we did it one chemical at a time. So what exposomics is doing is looking at thousands, even tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of chemicals at a time, and trying to whittle down the ones that don't seem to be having an effect from the ones that do seem to be having an effect. And instead of taking 60 years just to gather enough evidence for one chemical, we think we can gather the evidence for hundreds, perhaps even thousands of chemicals in a matter of tens of years instead of that amount of time. So we can actually look at more than one chemical, and we can do a really grand or omic approach so that we can start to understand which chemicals are important for our health and which chemicals are not. And that's really what exposomics is. So we started an institute for exposomics in 2017. We've been developing methods to measure thousands of chemicals in blood and urine. Some of these chemicals are pesticides. We can look at health effects. If we study them in populations, we can see whether or not they're higher in children who have diseases such as autism or asthma or other types of common diseases in childhood. And we can also interrogate different ones to see whether or not there are mixtures of chemicals. So it may not be that it's just one chemical that's doing this. In fact, that would seem very, very unlikely. It's actually the combination of chemicals. And so by looking at an exposomic approach, we can look at all of these combinations, and we can kind of understand this sort of, for want of a better phrase, soup that we're living in, and which ingredients of that soup are important and which ingredients are not. And that's really what exposomics is about. One of the advantages of an exposomic approach is that it's holistic, and it helps us to understand everything that we're exposed to. So a lot of times with pesticides, it's not clear what we're being exposed to. There's lots of choices that chemical companies and agricultural companies have in terms of the pesticides they use. And in normal monitoring, you sort of have to know in advance, or they have to report it to you. With an exposomic approach, where we try to discover all the chemicals in a sample, we're going to find chemicals if they're there, which is a very different way of doing research and a very different way of doing monitoring than the kind of monitoring where you have to know in advance. So a lot of what we're doing is going to be discovery, but a lot of what we're doing actually would also fit in terms of monitoring and being able to see that the systems that we think have changed, whether they're agricultural systems or whether they're the local soil or whether it's the local water, we can actually see whether or not those systems really are changing, and we can do it on a grander scale. So we can look at all the chemicals. And if a new chemical is being introduced, if it's related to a health effect, we should be able to find it with these exposomic approaches, which is a very, very different way of doing research than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. And I think because of that, we're more likely to be able to make advances at a very rapid timescale. So we're really interested in partnering with Beyond Pesticides because of their approach to try to develop organics, to try to develop more holistic approaches to keeping children safe from these chemicals. We can actually help in the sense that we can help to monitor what's going on in the soil, in the water, and in the foods. And in that way, I think we can all feel more comfortable that these advances are being made with a scientific perspective.